Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 11th of October 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we're delighted to be joined today by Mark Anderson, American Free Press. And of course, Mike also runs the Truth Hound blogspot. Well, I'm feeling safer today, Mike, because I understand that David Cameron has been on his travels and that fills me with confidence, but also the government is looking after our safety
online
at all levels.
Absolutely, because they have released their internet safety strategy. Is this anything to do with safety? Well, no, of course not. This is about regulation of the internet, and Britain leading the way on this. They are going to introduce a new social media code of practice, which they describe as a joined-up approach to remove or address bullying, intimidating, or humiliating online content. They're going to create an industry-wide levy so that social media companies and communication service providers contribute to raise awareness and counter internet harms. So there's going to be a fund for that. There's going to be an annual internet safety transparency report, which is going to show progress on addressing abusive and harmful content and conduct. And it's going to support technology and digital startups to think about safety first, ensuring that necessary safety features are built into apps and products from the very start. So this is fantastic news. Apparently in the past year, because the problem is that a fifth of 12 to 15-year-olds have encountered something online that they found worrying or nasty in some way, and 64% of 13 to 17-year-olds have seen images or videos offensive to that particular group. So there you go. We've got to deal with this nasty content on the internet. We've got to deal with it now. And who's going to do it? Well, it's going to be Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, Karen Bradley. And she said the internet has been an amazing force for good, but it has caused undeniable suffering and can be an especially harmful place for children and vulnerable people. So that's the problem, and this is what we're going to do about it. This is what she also said. She said that's what we're looking at, to make sure that we do regulate the internet in an appropriate way so that we allow the freedoms that the internet gives you. So let's just look at that again, because this quote I found particularly interesting, Brian. So what they're looking at is to make sure that we, the government, regulates the internet in an appropriate way so that we allow the freedoms, the government allows the freedoms.
Right, this will be the same government that's covering up the abuse of children in Westminster and by former Prime Minister Ted Heath.
Absolutely.
Same people are going to look after us. That's good.
She regurgitated the words of Theresa May when she said the behaviour that is unacceptable in real life is unacceptable on a computer screen. We need an approach to the internet that protects everyone without restricting growth and innovation in the digital economy. So we want to make sure that we censor the internet in such a way that it doesn't affect business, but we've got to make sure that people like the UK Column can't produce the news every day. That's what they're aiming for. Now, this is the Green Paper, their internet strategy document, and it sets out, as they say, the government's ambition to create a strong framework that can tackle online harms. All options will be carefully considered while collaborating with industry and charities and supporting children, parents and carers. So this is today's apparently is the first generation of children who are learning about relationships and sex in the online world. So this strategy also outlines the crucial role that education will play. So let's have a quick look at what they're saying here. First of all, new compulsory school subjects, relationship education at primary and relationship and sex education at secondary, to provide online safety education, because that's worked so well, Brian, right? Because only 2 days ago, the BBC was carrying this article, Child on Child Sex Offence Reports, Tip of the Iceberg. And what they were saying was that the reports of sexual assaults by children on other children are rising. The number of reported sexual offences by under 18s against other under 18s in England and Wales rose by 71% from 2013 to 14. From 4,600 in 2013-14 to 7,866 from 2016-17. And this is figures that were given to Panorama through a Freedom of Information request. And the numbers of reported rapes amongst under 18s rose 46% from 1,521 to 2,223. And they're saying that reports of sexual offences on school premises also increased, and they give figures for that as well. Now, I know that there are primary schools in Plymouth that are experiencing this problem, and this is not an uncommon problem now. What's the reason for this, Brian? Could it be perhaps that it's exactly this issue of sexualizing children ever younger through sex education and relationship education that's driving this? Could that be possibly what's going on?
Well, I think many parents would absolutely agree that that is one of the key reasons. And I'll say at the weekend at Ian Crane's event in the Connaught Rooms in London, Graham Downing gave an especially good presentation. And at the end of that presentation, he was actually showing the sort of material that children are now exposed to. And he simply took the music industry. What were children looking at in the 1970s? A lady sat at a piano singing. What are they looking at now? And of course, the BBC, very, very keen to promote highly explicit pop music to ever younger children. Does it have an effect? Undoubtedly. I would certainly say as a parent it has an effect. I'm sure other people would agree.
Okay, so let's look at what else they're proposing here. Social media safety advice. Government will encourage social media companies to offer safety advice and tools to parents, and safety messages will be built into online platforms. They're saying safety features highlighted. So the government will work to raise awareness around safety products and features that are available for parents. But here's the key one. It is important for children and young people to be aware that not everything they see and read online is real. Being able to distinguish between factual and fabricated content is a critical skill. In an age where children and young people predominantly get their news from social media outlets, it is important that they're given given the skills to critically evaluate the content they're consuming. So what they're saying is that as a matter of course, as a matter of the national curriculum, they're going to make it, they're going to tell children how to identify what is right material and what is wrong material, and they're going to encourage children to only read the right material.
This is Alice in Wonderland stuff, Mike, because of course at the switch of a button they could clear the whole internet of extremely unpleasant, highly explicit media material, but also sexual images. That could all be taken off overnight, gone. Why don't they want to do that? Because they're making money out of it. So we're now going to presumably show the children some of these images in order to say, oh, those are the images you don't want to look at. Well, and the other bit, sorry, I've just came into my head. Of course, we had the wonderful think tank Demos a couple of years ago was crowing that it was going to have its programme, and my goodness, you've got it on screen.
Absolutely. Truth Lies in the Internet from 2011, and from Demos, a report into young people's digital fluency. That's exactly right. So this is where this policy has come from. Now, the question then is, who is going to manage all this on behalf of the government? Here we have the independent, undoubtedly independent, UK Council for Child Internet Safety. And of course, it's not independent. They're not saying it is. I'm being a little bit sarcastic there. But the UK Council for Child Internet Safety is a group of more than 200 organisations drawn from across government, industry, law, academia and charity sectors that work in partnership to help keep children safe online. So the people that are generating the content which the government feels is harmful are also the people that are involved in this to a certain degree for some types of content. So who is involved in this? Well, we've got Apple, we've got the Association of Directors for Children's Services, we've got the BBC Children's Department, we've got the British Board of Film Classification, we've got British Telecom, we've got the Child Exploitation Online Protection Centre, which is part of the Metropolitan Police. We've got the ChildNet International. We've got the Children's Charities Coalition on Internet Safety. We've got the Diana Award. We've got Facebook, Google, the Information Commissioner's Office. We've got a couple of independents on there. We've got Internet Watch Foundation, London School of Economics, National Police Chiefs Council on there as well, NSPCC, which is the National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. We've got Ofcom, we've got O2 and Sky and TalkTalk and Twitter. So these are the organisations that are all going to be involved in making sure that children know what's the right thing to look at when they're on the internet.
So this is everybody apart from any proper representation from the general public. This is participatory democracy where these organisations have simply been chosen to give an opinion. And of course, where they're the charities, where they're the BBC even, those who control the purse control the political opinion. Perhaps we should invite Mark in. You've got a different situation in the States. What do you think of what we're producing here?
It's quite eye-opening. I cannot help but get fixated on what Mike started with, where the British authorities presume to say they're going to grant you internet rights. I mean, right out of the starting gate, they run right up against the fundamental view of what human rights even are. The idea of a pre-existing God-given right is anathema to these people. It's essential that we, right from the start, do not allow the authorities to define what rights are and then how they're quote-unquote distributed. So whatever the details might be, it's amazing how fundamentally flawed their argument and their system is. I will say that.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Mark. Well, let's move on to Brexit then. Well, he's come out of the woodwork, Brian. Nigel Farage has decided to speak up a week after the UKIP conference. And he's published an article in The Telegraph called "Theresa May is now the EU's Stepford wife, subservient and submissive to their every whim." He says, so there we have it. Theresa May does not believe in Brexit. In an interview with Ian Dale on LBC, she completely collapsed, proving incapable of answering the question of how she would vote if there was a referendum now. She simply would not answer if she would support leave. Everyone listening to the interview knows that the reality is that May is still a Remainer. I don't believe it's possible to carry out this great historic change against a huge amount of international criticism unless you truly believe in it, nor, as it happens, does May. In a speech on the 1st of June, she herself said, to deliver Brexit, you have to believe it. And then this is what he came up with next. This is the clearest proof yet that the great Brexit betrayal is underway. Well, Brian, I'm afraid I'm going to say that the only person who's betrayed anyone here, actually, is Nigel Farage, because he's the only one who stood up and said that he was for Brexit and campaigned for Brexit. And then as soon as the referendum result was in, he scurried off into his little hole.
Saying it was all, that was it. It was all done. It was all complete.
Despite the warnings and personal warnings as well, right? So Theresa May is nothing other than what she has always been. So, we can criticise Theresa May, and she deserves to be criticised on many, many fronts. But the fact of the matter is that it was obvious from day one that if Theresa May was going to be in charge of Brexit, that this is exactly where we were going to be. So the only person who's betrayed anyone is Nigel Farage.
Yeah, it was quite incredible what this man's done. And the key proof of the fact that Nigel Farage has led those 17 million voters into a corral is the fact he never, ever speaks about the key important points that we have a paedophile cover-up in British government. It involved Ted Heath. What was this to do with blackmail in order to get us into the European Union? This is a subject Farage doesn't cover. He doesn't talk about defence. He doesn't talk about jobs. He doesn't talk about the bank and the banking fraud at the moment. So there's nothing of substance about what's actually happening in this country. It's stand on the sideline and pretend that the problem is a European Union as opposed to the criminal activity inside the British government. We've warned about this man for a very long time, and of course he's like Tony Blair, he never disappears from politics.
Yes. Now, Mark, Sir Alan Duncan, well, what a man he is. He's been over visiting Chicago, apparently. So what on earth did he have? Well, of course, he was talking about the case for a global Britain. This is part of the whole Brexit scam, because right at the heart of the Conservative government's aims for a global Britain are, of course, the free trade agreements that we've been talking about, that are going to replace TTIP and TPP. But what was Alan Duncan talking about, and what are your thoughts on it?
Well, there were two more programs since the Disruptive Forces on Global Cities Chicago Council program that I covered recently, and I covered these other two in different ways. October 5th, the end of the transatlantic era, and October 2nd, Sir Alan Duncan, a minister of state for Europe and the Americas, who says he has 77 countries under his purview or realm, you might say. He described himself as a conservative MP since the 1990s. Again, Sir Alan Duncan. And what he talked about with Global Britain was a multifaceted thing, guys. I want to say right up front something that struck me during our earlier conversation here today on the newscast. And you're talking about children being exposed to, sexual content at too young of an age, and the entire internet system and parameters being set in the UK. I want to just jump forward because beyond talking about free trade and the sacred rules-based world order that the globalists like Sir Alan Duncan want to protect at all costs, beyond many of these fairly expected things, he said some things that reminded me of something about the neoliberal world order that's not usually discussed. One thing about the neoliberal world order, which is fixated on this rules-based free trade system and central banking and a usurious monetary system, one thing about them is they're extremely liberal in the social sense, in the cultural sense. So much so that Sir Alan Duncan talked about how Global Britain, one of its characteristics, in his view, is that it's contained in this. First of all, he said that he opposes the UK. He seems to speak for all the UK. The UK opposes all discrimination within the armed forces. And he was talking about his disagreement with President Trump's call for a ban on transgenders in the American military. And Alan Duncan says the UK will have nothing of a ban like that. They want full freedom for transgender people in the UK military. That's what he's calling for. But what's really interesting is that he said the Consul General of the UK in Chicago, quote, has done a great deal to promote the Love is Great campaign, both here in Illinois and across 14 states for which this Consul General is responsible. And get this, that includes participation in the Chicago and Denver gay pride parades. And he said, Sir Alan Duncan said that it's very laudable and a very good thing that the Consul General in Chicago, with whom Sir Alan Duncan associates, is bringing over the London Gay Men's Chorus to sing with their Chicago counterparts. And they did this a few months ago, actually. And so Mr. Duncan is extolling the virtues of the radical gay movement as if this is a normal component of the neoliberal world order. And in Toronto, in Chicago, in Denver, and other cities around the U.S. in these gay pride parades, grown men have fully exposed their genitals to young children. This is well known, it's well videotaped and well documented, and no one in the Chicago Council seems to take any exception with this. And this is an unknown and rarely discussed part of the neoliberal world order, that they're extremely liberal and they approve of groups and organizations that promote extreme sexual license and really demean the idea of a man-woman marriage, demean the idea of family, and demean the idea of traditional morality. So it's not just economics and political and geopolitical arrangements that these types are into. They're into an extremely unbridled social order that would include these things I'm talking about. And it certainly raises questions in light of the internet policies and exposure of sexual content to children and that entire paradigm. So I wanted to bring this out today.
Okay, now you did mention this other event, the end of the transatlantic era, and I want to just sort of run this in with the other organization you wanted to highlight today, Mark, which is the Atlantic Broker, which if we look at some of their forthcoming events, what have we got? The new normal, Trump, Brexit, and German foreign policy. We've got crumbling from within, the crisis of American superpower. We've got another event here called Your Truth is Not My Truth, politics in the changing media landscape. And the more I sort of look at the types of events that these internationalist organizations like the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and Atlantic Broker here are putting on, It seems that they are flailing around trying to find reasons for why this liberal agenda that you're talking about is being rejected by so many. They're struggling to get to grips with why the media isn't maintaining traction in people's minds, and they're struggling to get to grips with why their transatlantic agenda seems to be collapsing around them. Is that an unfair observation?
No, it's not, Mike. I think it's largely accurate. They seem to be like men in a laboratory or in some sort of control room, and they've got all these dials and all these buttons, and they keep pushing the buttons and they keep turning the dials. They keep trying to preset the dials on how the economy should go to serve them, on how politics should be constructed to serve the banker culture, which is really what's in charge here, not our politicians. They're just middlemen. They're just bagmen. And they keep adjusting the dials. They keep putting out their formulas and their studies, and nothing quite seems to stick. Just like I said with Sir Alan Duncan, they promote this extreme social order that's a huge departure from traditional morality and the family and normal human relations that have been the bedrock of civilization from the very beginning. They do all these things, and then they wonder why they don't stick. And the fact is that what they do and what they believe doesn't square with reality. It's la la land with a sophisticated veneer around it. That's all it is. And so, yeah, this Atlantic Bridge group that's translated, that's Atlantic Bridge in English. It's a German-based group. Max Bachmann, a young journalist I met at the last Bilderberg meeting in Virginia this year, he brought that out, and he sees it as kind of a mini Bilderberg. Of course, the Chicago Council is almost like that, too. And Max went out and filmed and confronted some members of this Atlantic Brücker, if I'm saying that right, or Atlantic Bridge, and tried to get them to talk. And they dismissed comparisons of themselves with the Bilderberg group. They said, oh, don't flatter us. We're nothing like that. But they're pretty much a bird of a feather. They're discussing the same kind of things. But they go off into this parallel universe that just doesn't square with reality. And at the end of the transatlantic era, the Chicago program that was given October 5th that I covered to some extent, it was a long program. Chatham House Thomas Raines spoke there, and even he had to admit, and he spoke a little bit more favorably of the Brexit people, the people that didn't want to remain. But even he had to admit that the bottom line is that Brexit, quote, didn't answer the question of how to leave the EU. And so even Chatham House, which is institutionally related to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, even this representative of Chatham House is admitting that people voted for Brexit. They expressed something, but it doesn't contain anything. There's nothing really tangible to explain how to get out of the EU. And he almost sounded like you guys, without quite going into all the details. So that was kind of an interesting twist as well, as were Sir Alan Duncan's views on the social order, as I mentioned earlier. So there's a lot to discuss here, but a lot of surprises. And Sir Alan Duncan is talking about upcoming papers and upcoming studies that are going to explain further how global Britain will remain global till its dying day, till its last breath, even though it's leaving the EU. He doesn't want to back down 1 inch. So all these studies and all this legislation is coming up, he says, to solidify the idea of a global Britain, whether it's in the EU or not.
Right. Well, look, we are going to, because we mentioned the media there, we're going to focus on the media in a second. Before we do that, we'll just mention once again from Stop Wars Media on Trial event taking place on Thursday, the 19th of October in Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church. Get along to it if you can. It's headlined by John Pilger, a bunch of other great speakers at that. Please get along. Details on Eventbrite. Tickets £9 in advance, I think £10 on the door. Now, I'm going to start off with our look at the media with this, Brian, because this is one of the BBC's special articles with its full of graphics and long-form articles that they think is going to increase people's engagement. And they're talking about heroin, and they ask the question, why is heroin killing so many people? It starts off describing one person's story, but very quickly starts getting into some statistics and about the number of people that are being killed by heroin and morphine-related deaths in England and Wales. And as you can see, generally it's the west and northwest, southwest not doing so well. But the question is, perhaps there's a bit of economics going on in this, and more social problems in more poverty-stricken areas and this kind of thing.
Well, that's true. We might also guess that the better quality drugs are coming into the wealthiest areas.
Possibly. Here we go. So this is the number of deaths of heroin, quite clearly outstripping other drugs, and quite an increase over the last few years. But then the BBC goes on to mention, of course, that most of the heroin that's coming into this country is coming from Afghanistan. Now, you would imagine then, Brian, would you not, that an investigative report might ask why these drugs are coming from Afghanistan, might cover the issue of Afghanistan in some detail. But no, this is about the height of it. And at the end of it, it says that basically stopping the problem at source seems to be impossible. So this is the BBC's answer. It's impossible to stop the problem at source. So there must be a more radical solution, perhaps, is what we want. So what do they promote? They promote the Swiss way. They promote the Swiss way. And what is the Swiss way? Well, that's all about the government buying up heroin and setting up clinics to allow people to come and get their heroin shots in a safe environment, decriminalising heroin and making sure that there's a safe environment for people to come and get their heroin. So in other words, what we've done here is that we have bombed the hell out of a country and created a problem of supply. So there's plenty of supply. And in parallel with that, we have created a problem of demand by making people's lives so crap that they have no option. Well, they do have options, of course, but basically you then flood the streets with a way for people to deal with their problems. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take that one step further, and we're going to have the government pay for the heroin that people. This is what the BBC is proposing. Right. That's a great solution, isn't it?
So the BBC unable to look at those statistics, which you've shown on many occasions on UK Column, showing that huge drop in poppy production while the Taliban were in power in Afghanistan, and the huge rise in the amount of drugs being produced while UK, the US and NATO have been involved. The BBC unable to get to those statistics, Mike, for some reason.
That's absolutely right. They don't mention the UN World Drug Report. They don't mention the supply side at all. They're not interested in it. They just say that it's impossible to deal with the supply side, despite the fact that it's a problem that we created.
Well, I'm going to say I'm not surprised, because we've had a little discussion with the BBC this morning. We'll come on to that in a moment. But Mark, drugs, huge problem, and we could say that this has been one of the most dangerous problems that the Western world has had to face.
Well, actually, the BBC is talking about the heroin problem in this country, but in the United States, Mark, heroin, the deaths as a result of heroin, this is reaching epidemic proportions.
Yeah, the CIA has long been suspected, pretty much proved, of trucking heroin into the U.S. as part of its black budget revenue raising. And it's interesting to think about history. Correct me if I'm wrong. Was not the British East India Company involved in the opium trade?
Oh, how dare you suggest such a thing, Mark?
Are we going to say, yes, of course, we admit it. We were not responsible. We do admit it. And of course, if we bring in the East India Company, we've got to bring in major banks who were part of the of the trail of drugs.
Yes, a four-letter acronym, banks, HSBC being the key one.
Yeah, no doubt about it. There's a historical precedent for all of this. Of course, the British fought in Afghanistan long ago, I believe in the 19th century, or was it the early 20th? Forgive me. Which one was it?
Early 20, I think.
Early at 20, yeah. So Britain and America have both been in this land before, the land of Afghanistan, the East India Company involved in the opium trade. And there were the opium wars involving Rothschild interests in China. So this does have a lot of history to it. We won't recap that today other than to mention it. But yeah, it's a huge problem here. I've been to Switzerland a couple of times. I saw some people on the streets that were considered druggies, and I heard about the program back in 2010. I can't judge it. Maybe in some limited instances, it has a tendency to cut down on crime because people aren't stealing to get money to buy heroin. But on the other hand, the U.S., if they wanted to, and the Brits and the Western coalition, they could get rid of the poppy fields tomorrow in Afghanistan with the use of napalm or defoliants or some other means, but they're not. They're protecting that racket, and that racket goes back a long ways. So this is a sacred cow that they don't want to touch.
Well, I mean, it's an essential sacred cow, Mark, because it's what's keeping the financial system afloat at the moment, and so it is absolutely required. And what you're absolutely right. People need help, and I'm not suggesting for one second that they shouldn't get help. But what the BBC seems to be promoting here is the opening up of an official market for this opium, which is being produced in Afghanistan, and that's not the answer to this problem. No. But the BBC,
it could very well be a false alternative, right?
But we've got some good news on the BBC front, because James Harding, the head of BBC News, is leaving his job at the end of the year. This is fantastic news, well, we can see the response that he's had on the Twitter sphere here. Lots and lots of people absolutely devastated that he's going, Brian, and I'm being sarcastic for anybody on radio, because the responses here are fantastic. They are just glad to see the back of this man. Absolutely seems to be universally credited with completely destroying BBC News.
Well, and what are the comments all about? They're all saying that BBC News is not to be trusted, that it's not high quality. It's rubbish is really what the theme of these tweets is about. And is that fair? Well, let's come on to one of Mr. Harding's little pets, which was BBC Reality Check. And I have a look at this fairly regularly to see what they're talking about. And this one caught my eye, this particular story here, Reality Check. Does educating women boost vaccinations? So that was an interesting headline. But what I picked up on, first of all, was that it's anonymous. We don't have a journalist who is connected to this. I went to the end of the article and there's no details. So this is just spewed out from the BBC Reality Check team. And I have to say I was very curious as to who was printing this material. So what are they saying? Throughout history, the empowerment of women has been linked to their education, which brings benefits not only to women's own lives, but to the lives of their children. In developing countries, research shows a strong link between the education of mothers and the immunisation of children against preventable diseases. There's then a famous BBC fact, because it says estimates. Estimates suggest that a quarter of deaths of children under the age of 5 could be prevented.
Where do these estimates come from?
Well, we're going to have a look at that, Mike, but this is the language. So this is fact. This is BBC News fact.
Right. Estimated fact.
Estimated fact could be prevented. So I think we're getting a flavour for the quality of the BBC reporting here by this mysterious anonymous person. It says, but the efforts to convince educated parents who are sceptical about vaccines to immunise their children is proving to be a much bigger job than might be expected. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh found that public health campaigns in the UK exposing the, quote, myth that child vaccines cause autism backfired by making parents more likely to believe the debunked conspiracy theory. So there's no substance to this article. This is innuendo, but oh dear, they're all getting worried that where the education rate increases, and presumably women have got not only the ability to think for themselves, but to actually work out what they're being told, more women are rejecting vaccines.
Right.
But it's an anonymous article. Here's the Times helping push this one. This is a detailed article about the findings. But the findings clearly show that where we're into Western countries where the women are educated and can get access to information, they're turning against vaccines. So I'm just going to say, isn't the real vaccine story here that when women are educated about vaccine risks, they refuse vaccines?
Okay.
Well, the BBC doesn't want to do that. So an anonymous BBC Reality Check article. You asked the question, Mike, where does this come from? Well, the major link to prove that the vaccines are working takes you through to the Johns Hopkins University here. And there's the graph. It doesn't give you any detail, but that's the first thing that hits your eye: global causes of child deaths. No mention of other factors, really. Nothing about poverty, cleanliness, clean water. This is all straight into vaccinations. Child mortality is common. And then we're straight into UNICEF. Nearly 8 million children under the age of 5 died worldwide in 2010. And it then leads into global Millennium Development Goals. So what this article really is doing is pushing UN global policy, as we're going to see here. As we get into the Johns Hopkins University, we're into their Centre for Global Health, transcending borders for world health. This is the meat of it. This is not just to do with vaccines. This is about, let's break down the nation state. Let's use health to do it. And some big heavyweights in here. And it doesn't take long before you find the links between Johns Hopkins University. I've just chosen one gentleman who got a research grant. He's down in the bottom right with the arrow. But this leads us to Gilead, which is boasting that it is one of the major biopharmaceutical organisations.
Right.
So if you just follow the BBC links, what it takes you to is the very big pharma organisations that are selling their products, whether they work or not. But I decided that I'd take the BBC on, so I called them to say, spoke to their press team to say, can you tell me who wrote this article? A 20-minute conversation when I was asked if I was making a complaint. They didn't understand my question. I simply said, could you tell me who wrote that BBC article? And eventually I had to go through the first lady and ask for her supervisor, and I got to a much more senior BBC press officer who said, well, I didn't really need to know who wrote the article because they work for the BBC and the BBC is an independent and trustworthy news organisation. So I'll pause slightly there. That's what the BBC says. We don't need to tell you who our journalists are. You don't need to know their experience. You don't need to know if they've got any affiliations through to drug companies. They work for the BBC. Trust us. We will tell you what to believe. And we're just join the circle up here because let's come back to Mr. Harding, because of course he proudly announced BBC Reality Check. He says the BBC, or he said the BBC can't edit the internet, but we won't stand aside either. We will fact check the most popular outliers on Facebook, Instagram and other social media. That was a Guardian report. He went on to say, we're working with Facebook in particular to see how we can be most effective, where we see deliberately misleading stories masquerading as news. We'll publish a reality check. No, Mr. Harding, it is Reality Check that is producing the fake news.
Masquerading as news?
Yeah, masquerading as real news. And he went on here, and we want Reality Check to be more than a public service. We want it to be hugely popular. We aim to use styles and formats online, on TV and on radio that ensure the facts are more fascinating and grabby than falsehoods.
Right.
I added a bit for him here, which is, and we'll keep the identity, experience and interest secret with anonymous BBC Reality Check reporters.
So bringing this right back to the beginning, Brian, then, the government is going to push, with its Green Paper and subsequent legislation, is going to push into the education system the skills that our children need to identify what's right and what's wrong on the internet.
Yeah.
And undoubtedly, BBC Reality Check is going to be on the right side of that, yeah?
Oh, of course, because the BBC told me very clearly in the telephone call that I really shouldn't be concerned that I didn't know who the journalist was because they worked for the BBC, and if they worked for the BBC, then that's fine. I did actually mention Jimmy Savile and said, well, the BBC journalists weren't entirely honest over Jimmy Savile, but the lady wasn't too keen on talking about that subject. Now, if you would like to learn more about vaccines and the dangers of vaccines, then I'm going to suggest that you get this very effective book by Christina England. Christina, of course, is a mother who took the trouble to really educate educate herself about vaccines, and she's been working with trained professionals such as Lucia Tomljanovic. So this is a lady trained in medicine and vaccine type issues, and we've got a foreword to this book by Dr. Michael D. Innes. So this is not just what a mother thinks, this is what a mother discovered. This is facts and information backed up by deep medical analysis and comment as well. And I've put on screen just the opening part of the book because I think this tells us all. Part one is legalized kidnapping of children by the state, effectively, possibly the largest vaccine cover-up the world has ever seen. And chapter one begins with the heading, Vaccination and Corruption in Government. So if you haven't got a copy of this book and you're concerned about vaccines, I think you should get it. Christina England you can find on the internet, and she is still doing absolutely tremendous work warning both mums and dads about the dangers of some vaccines, at least to children. I'll just end by saying I did also mention the subject of Epilim to the BBC press officer and pointed out that there are some 37,500 damaged children in the UK as a result of that drug. And this, of course, is another story that the BBC simply refuses to publish because the BBC, of course, is in bed both with the government and with the big pharmaceutical production companies. So there we are, the gross insult from the BBC. We will print the false information. It can be false, of course, as with that article, by omission of facts. But don't you worry, the BBC is looking after the safety of you and your family. Mark, you are very lucky in America to have some rogue private media companies. I think many people simply don't realise how the BBC simply acts as one huge British government propaganda machine, because so many people worldwide have fallen for the lie that the BBC is truthful and independent.
That's true to a point, Brian. The Public Television Corporation here, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and all their PBS outlets, the closest one to here is Elkhart, Indiana. They pump the same basic narrative, but they just don't have the all-pervasive influence and ubiquity of the BBC or the CBC in Canada. Now, the many ills associated in Canada with widespread casino gambling, kidnapping, embezzling, all manner of social ills there. The government, the OLG, the Ontario Lottery and Gaming, for example, pays huge amounts of lottery and gaming advertising to all the Canadian media, including the CBC, and they turn a blind eye and go silent on the huge problems associated with the gambling industry there. That's another angle on all this. But the CBC in Canada gets $1 billion a year, and they're much more like the BBC. Now, again, PBS here is not quite so pervasive, but the same basic narrative is still there, and they still get way too much of our tax money. But yes, we do have a more tenacious independent media here to some extent, at least in the U.S. And the fact that we associate and do what we're doing, of course, helps backstop that and gives the truthful narrative a chance. Obviously, to sum it up today, these forces, the vaccine companies, which are part of Big Pharma, and the big media, there's a lot of ad dollars exchanging hands there. They're trying to protect their narrative at all costs. Like you say, they don't even tell you that the vaccination laws are not compulsory. You don't have to have vaccinations in the UK legally. The same is pretty much true here in the US, but they want you to believe they're compulsory. There's so many other ways to strengthen the human immune system without vaccines. Vaccines throughout their entire history have had a exaggerated effect and exaggerated place in our worldview, and they're just not as effective as we're told they are, and they never really have been. A few of them have done a little marginal good to human health, but if we had a true system with allopathic, and not just allopathic, I mean naturopathic and homeopathic medicine, and all these disciplines were allowed to flourish, maybe acupuncture and Eastern medicine, not just Western medicine, and a more holistic view, then we wouldn't have these problems in human health and life expectancy and infant mortality. All of that would improve drastically. So all these alternatives are also squelched as these companies try and maintain their profits and their narratives.
Mark, thank you for that. I totally agree. There's so much out there that if it was reported properly and, of course, looked at accurately for benefits and disadvantages, that we would be able to move forward. There we are. Thank you for joining us, Mark. We'll say to our audience today, you've listened to UK Column News. We're here because we have believed for many years that UK and audiences in the world need something alternative to the BBC. If you like what we are doing and you can give us support, that would be wonderful. A subscription makes all the difference. Remember, the BBC runs on a budget of 3.74 billion, but is unable to tell you who produces its daily articles. We're sitting here on a budget which has several zeros after the decimal point before we get to our budget, and any help you can give us with a donation or a subscription will be gratefully received. Thank you very much. We'll be back tomorrow, and we'll also be including David Ellis to have a look at what's really happening now with the total destruction of Britain's armed forces. Thank you. Bye-bye.